Good evening. You guys hear me okay? Thank you, Abraham. All right, the handouts that Brother JC and Abraham passed out to you guys might look familiar to you. Jim was kind enough to give me some notes for this evening. So we'll go through these notes that he gave us, and we'll pause and make a few points. We'll probably have to go through them a little fast. So if you look at the top of the page, the first section, our basis for justice is blind. Leviticus 19:15, you shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. Deuteronomy 1:17, you shall not show partiality in judgments. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You guys think of any examples of that? One came to my mind whenever I was thinking of this. You guys think that happens today? With people being charged and sentenced to certain things, facing courtrooms? Do you think that happens today where people get impartial? No, John? One that came to my mind was, immediately popped in my head, was when I was in high school. You guys probably heard of it, Leonard Little. I remember when that first happened. For you guys that don't know Leonard Little, he was a football player. Tennessee, yeah. I know. And you guys are fans of that. I'm playing. No, so I remember being in high school and hearing about it. Like, for those that don't know what happened, Leonard Little was drinking and driving, and he hit and killed a woman with her 2 children in the car and faced 0 jail time, right? He got off with probation and a lot of community service. And I remember at the time, I was at an age where I'd hear of people, my age and a little bit older, getting DWIs, not injuring people, and they're facing jail time, They just get put, and I remember thinking back then, like, you see the comparison there. Someone that's plays a professional sport that has a lot of money, and, we need him on the team, so that guy, he gets a different judgment than somebody. So that was just one that kind of came to my mind. We see that today too. So let's look at the responsibility of judges. Next section, Deuteronomy 16:19. Regarding judges, you shall not distort justice, you shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe. I'm sure none of that's happening today either. Exodus 23:7. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. And Jim's little note here, Pilate violated his responsibility as a judge, giving way to the bribery of politics. So, we think about it. Pilate knew that Jesus was not worthy of being crucified, right? And he even stated that, but he let the crowd and the public determine his decision, right? And Brett had a lesson on this a couple weeks ago, his fear of losing power, right? All right, next section, need for multiple witnesses. Whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses, but one witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for the death penalty. Deuteronomy 19:15, one witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established. Can anyone think of why this is important to have more than one witness? Come on, guys.
Your eyewitnesses are not always correct.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying they lie, they just don't see things as another eyewitness over here might see.
Right. And that's why it's good to have multiple witnesses so that they can verify the story that's being told, right? They may not have seen it correctly. You do have people that will lie and lie on the witness stand. Being put under oath doesn't change whether or not they're going to lie. But we see here, God lays out the reason, the importance of why we need multiple witnesses. Exodus 26, perjury and false witnesses. Exodus 20:16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Exodus 23:1, you shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. Leviticus 19:16, you shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. Exodus 23:1, you shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. One thing this scripture here reminded me of this too is we've talked about in the past gossip, right? You hear something, you don't know whether or not it's true, you don't have the proof it's true, you're just going off of someone else's statement. What they may have heard it from someone else or a previous person, or they may have just came up with it themselves, and it may not be true, but then you're circulating that false narrative, statement or accusation against somebody, right? So that's a good one right there to remember. Deuteronomy 19, verse 18 through 19. If the witness is a false witness who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. So look at what he tells us that in Deuteronomy, what to be done with someone who is a false witness. One that I kind of thought of with this was Mordecai and Haman, right? You guys familiar with what happened to Haman, right? He was hung on the very gallows that he made for Mordecai, right? Those that falsely accused Jesus should have been crucified. So think about that. They were falsely accusing Jesus. They should have essentially faced the punishment that they were trying to get him punished for. Matthew 26:59, the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus. And so now we're going to go into, we see where people kind of conspire together, right? So you can still have those multiple witnesses where if you get a group together and they kind of conspire, come up with a plan to conspire against somebody, like they did with Jesus. Mark 14:56, many were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. Jim kind of touched on that the other day, right? They were falsely put a false testimony against Jesus, but they weren't even consistent in their testimony. And one thing I thought of, I was watching a show the other day that actually brought this up. It was one of the police detective shows, right? And the police officer walks out after being on the scene of a dead body, right? And there's 3 witnesses outside. And he tells the police officer that's just, the uniformed police officer that's just there kind of getting the crowd back, he says, oh, where's the witnesses? 3 of them right over there. You kept them together, right? Typically, when something like that happens, what they do is they separate the witnesses so that they can't come together and corroborate a story, a false story, right? So they split the witnesses up to keep them separate, and they take their statements and their testimonies apart from each other. Any comments, questions? Nobody. All right, let's move on. John 18:30, the high priest leading Jesus before Pilate, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. False witnesses violate the laws of God. Matthew 7:12, the golden rule. However you want people to treat you, so treat them. Let's turn to that scripture real quick. Matthew 7, verse 12. Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So obviously the men that were conspiring against Jesus weren't thinking that way, right? Because I'm sure none of them would like to have somebody throwing false accusations their way. Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbors as yourself. All right, let's move on to the next section. Look at the apostles. Jesus selected 12 disciples were with him throughout the last week of his life. They received extensive instruction from Jesus. They all were present for the Last Supper in the upper room on Thursday evening. 8 of the apostles escaped in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested: Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot. They fled and did not reappear until mentioned after Jesus' resurrection. Mark 14:50. Then they all forsook him and fled. All right, so first one we'll look at is Judas. As you all know, Jim kind of touched on it Sunday. Betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver due to greed. After Jesus was condemned, feeling remorse, Judas committed suicide by hanging. Another thing that Jim kind of touched on that Judas did was he went back in and he threw the money, the silver down, right? The 30 pieces of silver, he threw it down at their feet. One thing that kind of made me think of is my cousin back when we were middle school, high school maybe. He stole a pack of gum from a gas station, right? And when I found out he did, I kept telling him, like, how wrong he was and why he shouldn't have done it. We should go back. You need to pay. And he got so mad, he threw the pack of gum across the field. There, you happy, right? And this kind of reminds me that it's like that doesn't take away from what you done, right? It doesn't make it okay. It doesn't forgive you for what you've done. You know, you got to take the necessary steps to, like I said, he should have gone back, admitted what he done, paid for it, and tried to make amends for it. James was one of the 3 apostles Jesus asked to watch with him while he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. He fell asleep along with Peter and John. Matthew 26. Verse 37. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. He also fled as the others had after Jesus was arrested, did not reappear until after Jesus' resurrection. Peter was one of the 3 apostles Jesus asked to watch with him while he prayed in the garden. He fell asleep along with James and John. Was one of the 2 apostles that brought a sword with him. He cut off the ear of the slave Malchu of the high priest among the mob that came to arrest Jesus. Jesus healed the slave and was arrested anyway. Jim made a very good point on Sunday that I never really thought about, is the fact that Jesus healed his ear, right? And how nobody took notice. Like that didn't, reaffirm or change anybody's mind and what they were about to do, right? I just never thought of that until Jim kind of pointed that out. So, that was a great point that he made on Sunday. He also fled as the others had after Jesus' arrest, went to the courtyard of the high priest's house as Jesus was being tried. When recognized as one of Jesus' followers, denied knowing Jesus 3 times as Jesus had prophesied. Go ahead and turn to Matthew 26. So back in verse 35, Jesus prophesies that Peter is going to deny him 3 times. And each time he says, there's no way, Lord. Verse 35, Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples, right? So when Jesus tells Peter that he's going to deny him, he says, there's no way. Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And we see in the verse listed here, verse 70 through 75, but he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you are saying. And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, this fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth. But again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And a little later, those who stood by came up and said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for your speech betrays you." Then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So he went out and wept bitterly. All right? Peter went out and did not reappear until after Jesus' resurrection. John was one of the 3 apostles Jesus asked to watch with him while he prayed in the garden. He fell asleep along with Peter and James. He also fled as the others had after Jesus' arrest. Mark 14. Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body, and the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. So John may have been the young man the mob tried to grab and left his garment behind. John 18:15, John was known by the high priest and was present when Jesus was being questioned. Was the only apostle present at Jesus' crucifixion. John addressed himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John was given charge by Jesus to care for his mother, Mary. He took her to live in his home. That's John 19. Verse 26, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour that disciple took her to his home. All right, the high priest, Caiaphas. Now Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of all the people. The high priest spoke the truth, but did not intend it as God did. Caiaphas, the chief priests, and the Pharisees thought if everyone came to believe in Jesus, Rome would come and destroy them. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The word gave means sacrificed. Pontius Pilate. He was the governor of the Roman province, Judea, mentioned 56 times in the New Testament. The high priests and Pharisees delivered Jesus before Pilate for trial. As we said before, Pilate found no guilt in Jesus. And Jim touched on it Sunday also, that when Pilate found out that Jesus was from Galilee, he sent him to Herod. And then eventually Herod sent him back to Pilate. After Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate, he wanted to release him. But like we talked about before, he gave in to the riot. Wanting to avoid a riot and appease the Jewish leaders, Pilate condemned Jesus. Became a friend of Herod. If you would look, Luke 23:12. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been in enmity with each other. So that before they weren't even friends. Now they're friends after they came together with this. As a last attempt, Pilate, as governor, had a tradition of releasing a condemned man at the Passover. He offered the people Jesus or a murderer named Barabbas, expecting they would choose an innocent man over a convicted killer. So, I mean, Jim touched on that Sunday too. Think about that. He puts up this convicted killer thinking that they would want to release him, but they were so set on crucifying Jesus that they were willing to release someone that they knew was a murderer, right? To, crucify someone blameless, right? And then Pilate declared himself innocent of Jesus' blood, washing his hands before the people and placing the blame upon them. Herod, this was Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great. He was the one who had John the Baptist arrested and beheaded, was tetrarch of Galilee. Herod was glad when Pilate sent Jesus to him. Turn to Luke 23, we're there, just back up to verse 7. So when Herod first receives him, verse 7, and as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. So when he first received him, he was excited, right? Because he hears all these great things that he's been doing. He's like, oh, I've been wanting to see him, And he's expecting to see some great thing done, and you see Jesus' response, right? He doesn't say nothing, which then in turn, if we continue on, you see, and the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. When I read this verse, I don't know if I'm reading it wrong, but it makes me think of somebody that's kind of throwing a little temper tantrum, right? You're not giving me what you want. You're not listening to me. So now I'm going to treat him with contempt, right? And mock him, so to say. Quick change of his attitude towards Jesus, right? Remember, initially he was excited to see him because he was hoping for Jesus would perform a miracle. Herod and his soldiers mocked Jesus, wrapped him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. And like we said before, he and Pilate had been adversaries before, but now became friends. Jim had a little typo there. That is chapter 23, verse 12, which we read as we were going over Pilate. The women at Jesus' crucifixion. Mary, his mother. Actually, let's just read John 19, verse 25. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother, and they also go to Matthew 27:56. Among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. So we have Mary's mother, Mary's sister, Jesus' aunt, Mary, wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, and the mother of James and John. Two thieves on the cross. They were crucified at the same time as Jesus, one on each side. Fulfilled the prophecy, he was numbered with transgressors. Matthew 27:44. At first the robbers were joining in insulting Jesus. One of the criminals continued to hurl abuse against Jesus. Turn to Luke 23. Start in verse 39. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other answering rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." So we see one of the thieves said, "Do you not fear God? We receive what we deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Right? So he's acknowledging that him and the other thief, they're receiving what they deserve. Jesus, however, doesn't deserve to be there. And he says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." This is the form of the good confession. In verse 43, we see what Jesus says to the thief. And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly, I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise." Jesus said to the thief, Jesus had the authority to forgive sins. This, I was talking to JC about this. When I read this, I've had studies with people in the past that they always want to point out the thief. When you're talking baptism, right? They always want to throw that in your face, like the thief wasn't baptized, right? And Jesus said he'll be in paradise. And I always point out the fact that, you know, they were on Jesus hadn't died yet, right? But this is a great point in chapter 9, verse 6. But that you may know that the Son of Man has the power on earth to forgive sins. Then he said to the paralytic, "Arise, take your bed, and go to your house." So one thing that kind of hit me was, it didn't really dawn on me, but like, let's say the thief, for argument's sake, let's say the thief did have to be baptized, right? Who has the authority to let him go on that one, right? Does that make sense? Who has the authority other than Jesus to say, you know what, you don't need to be baptized? If he needed to be baptized. Like people like, you get what I'm saying? That makes sense? Kind of confusing you more? Okay, so any comments, questions? No? All right. Last section, the centurion in charge of the crucifixion. The centurion, when he saw the signs at Jesus' death, began praising God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent," literally righteous. Matthew 27:54, the centurion said, "Truly this was the Son of God." All right. Any comments, questions before we close? No? Brother Joe, you mind lead us in a closing prayer?
Dear most gracious Heavenly Father, how thankful we are that we have an opportunity to come together to study your word. We're so thankful for our brother, Dan, for his willingness to present the message to us. Thankful for Brother Jim and his continued work. Thankful for Brother JC and all those that study and present. Thankful for each and every one that's here in attendance that's also studying and meditating upon the things which we are trying to ingest. Help us, Father, as we continue to learn more and write these things in our heart to grow in wisdom so that we might be pleasing in your sight and we might continue to serve you and uphold your will. Father, when we fail and fall short, please forgive us of our sins. Please, Father, help us to continue about our daily business. And that business is that of yours, that we continue to spread the gospel, continue to reach out to those around us, set a good example, and to teach the truth from the Scripture. Father, we know that there are many here in our number. Our minds are especially with Jan this time and with the others that were mentioned this evening. And we pray that you be with them as they experience loss or they're going through particular challenges or difficulties. And we pray, Father, that you help them to keep their focus and their minds set on you, on their task at hand themselves. Father, as we go throughout the remainder of our evening, we pray that if it's your will, you allow us to reach our destination safely and to come together again. All these things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Almost walked off with it.
Attention there.